Begin I'm the only thing standing between you and the weekend, so I'm going to try and zip through this pretty quickly. What we are going to do today is very much like we did last time. We're going to talk about cancer. These are three topics that are very much connected to each other. And it may not be clear now that they are, but hopefully by the time we get through these lectures tonight, and maybe we won't make it all tonight, maybe we'll have to go into Monday, you will understand the connection between cancer, the immune system, and HIV/AIDS. And then after we get started on that, we won't get finished with it, but after we get started on it, we will go to the fourth quiz number 4, which will be followed by the break, just like last time, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about cancer, the immune system, and HIV/AIDS. So let us begin with some things that were very preliminary to understanding cancer, which is something that we all understand and in fact is very important to our daily well-being, and that's cell division. Cell division is going on in our bodies right now for a whole variety of reasons. Some of it is just replacing cells. All of our cells are turning over regularly, and so there have to be new cells to make sure that that can happen. But just the slightest little bump, which probably all of you have had in the last hour or so, that might cause a little bit of a bruise, probably cause some damage that has to be repaired with cell division. So cell division is very, very common, and so we're going to be talking about something that is very common at its base. But what is big and different is the fact that cancer is uncontrolled cell division, and so we are going to look at cases of uncontrolled cell division. Cancer is ugly. It is the single disease that people are most frightened of, and we all know about lots of different kinds of diseases, not the least of which is another one that we'll be talking about. I just chose the top 2 when people named the disease that they were most frightened of. Cancer was one of them, but the other was impaired fluid flow. It's what causes heart attacks and strokes and so on. So we'll talk about that after we talk about this. But today we're talking about uncontrolled cell division. When cells, the division of cells that normally helps us, heals us, when it gets out of control. And this kind of thing can happen in any of our tissues, absolutely any of our tissues. Our skin, our liver, our heart, every single one of our organs can get cancer. So it's very unusual and strange in that regard. It can attack any tissue that we have. Now, it was thought that when we understood cell division, it's a long time ago, but it was thought that when we understood exactly what cell division was, that's when we would be able to deal with cancer. And in fact, this was solved. This whole business of what happens when cells divide was solved, and so we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And but that didn't solve the problem. A long time ago, a particular president of the United States, Richard Nixon, declared that we were going to solve cancer in 10 years. He gave people 10 years, just like John F. Kennedy said at one time, we're going to land on the moon in 10 years. Nixon said we are going to solve cancer in 10 years. Didn't happen, still hasn't happened, and maybe you'll have some notions of why it hasn't happened after we get through with this section. What is amazing is how much we knew about the way the body acted. We knew lots about evolution, for example, And we knew, and that was all of Darwin's work, and we knew lots about genetics, and that was Mendel's work, without ever having a clue about what was going on inside the cells. That's what's continually amazing. So we knew that, but this next step, how were we going to solve cancer when we understood what was going on when cells divided? That's still an open question. And so, how do we know exactly what was going on? It goes back to these two, and I'll bet you recognize this picture. These are two of the three people that won the Nobel Prize a long time ago in 1962, but they won it because they were able to tell us, the world, what DNA actually looked like. It was one of those great game changers in the whole world of science, this business of knowing what DNA looks like. And the important thing for us right now is that knowing what DNA looked like and how it acted was what told us how cells divided, what was going on at the molecular level that when cells divided. So this is Watson, and this is Crick, Jim Watson and Francis Crick, and they were two of the three people. They were the two major people that worked on the structure of DNA. Jim Watson, a very young, just graduated with his PhD from Indiana University in America, and Crick from Great Britain. And they worked on this together, and they found out what the structure of DNA was and is. All of you had this probably in your high school biology, if not before. And the other person that was involved was this guy, Maurice Wilkins, and he worked in the same place in Britain that the two of these collaborated. So the three of these folks discovered between them what the structure was of DNA. There was a fourth person, Rosalind Franklin, and lots of times people will say this was one of the first big cases of male chauvinism, because Rosalind Franklin deserved that Nobel Prize just as much as the other three. What she did was she contributed a lot to the structure, to understanding the structure of DNA through her work with X-ray diffraction. However, even though it might have been that way had she lived, she didn't live. She died of cancer, as a matter of fact, and she died before 1962. And Nobel Prizes, for better or for worse, are not given to people posthumously. They're not given to people after they have died. And so Rosalind Franklin made a great contribution. Without her work, as a matter of fact, somebody had to do that work, and she's the one that did it first. And without that work on X-ray diffraction, Watson and Crick would not have been able to figure out the structure of DNA. Now, I've already said that if you ask people to rank the diseases that they are most frightened of, cancer is one of them. And there are the two major ways of fighting cancer are chemotherapy and radiation therapy. This is what we always hear about, and there are certain cancers that yield to these treatments. The cancers never seem to be totally wiped out, and people talk about 5-year survival rates and 3-year survival rates. But in fact, there's always the possibility that the cancer will come back. This is not the best, unfortunately, for all of us, not the best way in which cancer can be dealt with. Now, the cancer that I'm talking about now is the cancer that we all hear about, and that's the cancer that happens when very early on stages of cancer, the single cells or maybe the 3 cells or the 8 cells, and we'll get to this in a moment, when they escape, because our body has a very efficient way of dealing with cancer in its earliest stages. So what we see when we see something that we call cancer is something that has escaped. and the cells, they start to divide and they're out of control, but they're very quickly shut down, and they're stopped. As I said, neither chemotherapy or radiation therapy are the best at treating cancer, but they're the best that we have. When I say they're not the best, I'm talking about, this is from personal experience, but also from experience with lots and lots of people. Radiation therapy and chemotherapy are cruel and unusual punishment. And if you've known anybody that's gone through them, you know that that's the case. And it's great when they turn out to give people extra years in their life, but they're not at all pretty. Now, this is what we're going to spend some time talking about before we're through talking about this, and this is the immune system. And the immune system, in fact, recognizes cancer cells, the earliest cancer cells, as not self. Just like it recognizes the things that the immune system goes after are things that used to be called not self, now they're called non-self. They are cells that seem not to be our own cells. And whenever that happens, whenever anything gets into our bodies or forms that seems different than what is normal in our bodies, the immune system says, alert, alert, bad cell in our presence, and off it goes in all of its mechanisms to try and destroy those not self cells. These lectures are in 4 different parts, so we right now have to take just a moment to go to the next one. Do you have them right in order? Oh, great. So now let's talk some more about cancer. And again, I'm going to repeat this important point that it's cancer, that cell division is not the big problem. Cell division is not the big problem. In fact, that happens all the time, just as I began the first part discussing. It happens all the time, and it happens to our credit and to our good. Cell division is crucial and important to our well-being. It's the uncontrolled cell division that is the problem. So I told you that cancer can happen in any of our cells, any of our organs, any of our cell types. It can happen anywhere in our body. There is a cancer with all kinds. Of course, each one has a different name, but they're all essentially the same problem. We've got some cells that have taken off, and they're dividing uncontrollably, and that's a problem. That's a problem. Now, one that I'm going to talk about, point I was making just now is that we could be talking about all kinds of different cancers, but pancreatic cancer is in one particular way unique and interesting, because this is what you always hear about pancreatic cancer. If you get it, you are told, get your affairs in order, because you may have a livable life for about 6 months, and your total life may be about another 2 or 3 years, but you are not going to survive pancreatic cancer. You are going to, it's going to get you. Now, cancers, in fact, occur in plants as well. Now, we've been talking several times, we refer to the fact that plant cells and animal cells are very much the same. And they're no different in this regard. There are cancers that can happen with plants, just like there are cancers that can happen with animals. Now, we're not going to get into it, but there are some very unusual cancers that have distinct form. And in fact, they may even form particular parts of our body. We may find teeth growing in the midst of a cancer tumor, or the beginnings of eyeballs, and it's weird and unusual to think about, but that's the case. In the case of these plant cancers, here we have that hardly seems uncontrolled. In fact, there's a very distinct form to it, and there's a very distinct form to these, very distinct form to these, but not here and not here. So just like in humans, they can be just masses that have no form at all except they're blobs. They're big bunches of cells that resulted from uncontrolled cell division. It turns out that this is actually a trio of pictures of what are called galls. And in a sense, you might look at these and say, well, that looks pretty controlled to me. This is might be cell division, but it looks pretty controlled to me. But the problem is, it's not controlled by the leaf. It's a wasp. These happen to be, and there are other things that can cause this to happen, but these are caused by wasps. So a wasp comes in, essentially stings the leaf, and the formation, and in reaction, this is formed. The leaf is taken over, in a sense, by the wasp, these are formed. And what purpose do they serve? Well, it's inside these galls that the larvae for the wasps form and eventually break out, and they go their way and they're gone. These, on the other hand, are just formless masses like most human cancers or animal cancers are. Now, back to pancreatic cancer. As I said, it comes and you are going to go eventually. And here's one. There are lots of famous people that have died from pancreatic cancer, but one of them happened to be Patrick Swayze. He died, I suppose it's probably about 4 years ago now. He was a famous movie star, and you may or may not know him. But in about 1 year, he went to looking like this to looking like this. He really went downhill in a hurry, and he fought it. He was one of the people that had the money to go all over to different parts of the world, and we're going to talk about one other person where that was the case, to try and find a solution to this pancreatic cancer. And he could not find a solution. He died from pancreatic cancer. And here's another one. You probably know this name. Usually I could look up here and I could see, so there's one right there. An Apple product, and there are many great ones. I have one sitting on the desk here as well. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs got to be about 48 years old, and he was very young when he made his first discoveries, about 48 years old, when he found, maybe a little older than that, we found out he had pancreatic cancer. Steve Jobs also traveled all over the world looking for people, talking to physicians that said they thought that maybe they had a way of curing pancreatic cancer. But they did not, and he very quickly began to look much older than he actually was. I think he was 54 when he died, and this is closer to what he looked like in the end. Why is pancreatic cancer so difficult to handle? I mean, after all, there are other kinds of cancers that we seem to be able to handle much better. Some of the simplest skin cancers, for example, the so-called surface cancers, the skin cancers. Breast cancer is another one, although it's a bit more difficult. Some cancers, there are treatments that seems to get rid of the problem, but not true for pancreatic cancer. And there are two big difficulties with pancreatic cancer. One is that the symptoms of pancreatic cancer do not come on until the cancer is much advanced. And I don't know enough to know exactly why that's the case, but that is the case. So the cancer is much advanced, and in the far stages of its development, and it's only then that the patient begins to feel symptoms, feel like something is wrong. So that's one of the problems with pancreatic cancer. And another is that it's very difficult to get the treatment to the cancer. Remember, the treatments are chemotherapy, and the primary treatments are chemotherapy and radiation. therapy. And seems to be very difficult to get those to the actual cancer, where that's not true for lots of other cancers. And so those are the two things that I didn't know about, those two problems, until Steve Jobs died, and they talked about the reasons why pancreatic cancer was so difficult. So what we have is a situation where a normal cell with normal chromosomes, like this one. Remember, we saw we saw an actual picture of a chromosome that normally does this when it's dividing, when the cells are dividing, or when that DNA is making proteins, products of DNA, and everything seems perfectly okay. And so you have a circumstance like this where you have DNA, its code, the importance of its genes is that they hold the code for different kinds of RNA, and the RNA, in fact, hold the code for different kinds of proteins. It's all of this that was discovered by Watson and Crick, by the way, just an incredible accomplishment. Now, the other thing that DNA does, though, is that it divides in its entirety. Every single gene in that DNA is reproduced, and it can divide as part of and become two bunches of DNA instead of just the one bunch when the cell is dividing, so that there is an equal and identical group of genes or chromosomes that are part of the new daughter cell. So that's what happens in the normal circumstance. These dividing cells, again, it's hard to tell the difference. If you're looking at the roots of a plant, that's a very easy place to get at dividing cells because the tip of that root is growing very rapidly. Or a particular egg formation, like in the whitefish embryo. That's in elementary biology classes. These are two very common cells that are used just to take a look at cell division. And if you are careful, you can find all of the different stages of cell division. So these are cases of 1,000 that could have been shown of cell division happening in its normal fashion. Now, as I said before, cell division is a normal process, something that happens in our bodies all the time, that's going on right now as we talk about it, and it is only when it escapes that it causes a problem. And that problem can be a severe problem. For example, here are just a few. This is very common cancer of the mouth, unfortunately too common. This one is thyroid cancer. Here are some basal cell, very common skin cancer, not uncommon, especially if you're in the sun a lot. So these are cancers that happen regularly and have to be treated quickly. They don't normally get this far before somebody goes to a doctor to find out what the problem is. But here are some others. This one is cervical cancer. I've never learned exactly why cervical cancer is so common. This one is colon cancer. You probably have heard of a colonoscopy. Colonoscopy itself is not a problem. It's all of the preparation that has to be done ahead of time that is. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can find when you're doing a colonoscopy, and remember, these are all cancer types. These polyps can happen in the colon, and if they're very broad at the base, like this one is, then they've got a big problem. And the only way that that can be handled is by cutting out that section of the colon and resectioning it. If it's more like a polyp and it's just this on a stalk, then even as the colonoscopy is being done, it can be snipped off and taken out, and that usually solves the problem, because the cell division seems to be primarily here at this tip. This one is important to me because it was when I was your age, and I was at a state fair in Colorado. And at this state fair, they had these two examples of these two lungs right here. And this one is from a non-smoker, and this from a smoker. I smoked at the time. I was like 20. I haven't smoked since. That really scared me. I mean, you're really putting your lungs into a bad state of affairs by smoking. You may not be convinced by anything else, but when you see what's happening in the lungs, that convinces you, and you are very likely to stop. This is Lance Armstrong. Is that a familiar name to anybody? Lance Armstrong? Why is that familiar? What was he?
Is he the rider of the Tour de France?
Very good. Tour de France. He's a bicycle rider. He's won the Tour de France more than anybody else. And it's even more amazing because he had a very severe case of testicular cancer before he won half of the races that he won. And but he has survived. Again, that's a surface cancer. Occurs at the surface. Here's another one, oral cancer. A couple of examples of that. There's just one thing I want to mention about cell division before we go on, and that is that I have only talked about normal cell division. This is mitosis, and again, it's something that very likely you saw at one time or studied at one time or another. In fact, there are two different kinds of cell division in both males and females, and that is the cell division to form gametes. Remember when we talked about Mendel, we talked about the fact that there seemed to be two types for every gene, and that's because there are two chromosomes, homologous chromosomes, chromosomes that you could take and pair up. And we saw that picture of them being paired up, and they're very similar, but they're not identical because, for example, one of those chromosomes might have the gene for blue eyes and the other for brown eyes. Now, they both have the gene for eyes, so they're similar in that regard, but they could be subtly different. Well, those homologous chromosomes are separated at only one time during the course of the life cycle of an individual, and that's when meiosis takes place. It's very similar to mitosis. This is the cell division we've been talking about. But meiosis is when those homologous chromosomes are actually separated and divided into the two gametes. That's why when the gametes are formed, if the parent has the gene for blue eyes, but on the other chromosome it has the gene for brown eyes, they can be found in two different gametes because they're separated, they're split. So that's cell division, the second kind of cell division, and it takes the total number of chromosomes down to half the original number, and that's called meiosis. And one last thing about cancer, and that is that we've been talking about it as if it suddenly broke loose and took off. It's probably not. It's probably incorrect of me to describe it like that, because it seems like it takes more than one event to get for a cell to become truly cancerous. Some people have suggested that it takes, in fact, 4 different separate mutations, and that finally will kick this cell into uncontrolled cell division. Now, that's not inconceivable because cell division is very complex, and it may well be that you've got to get 4 different things screwed up before it will really get into uncontrolled cell division. And I guess to the end of chapter 2, so let's just now, I said before, we just talked a bit about cancer, and I've said before that that we're going to connect the immune system to this. And you know what? I don't want to just start on this and then have to quit. So now, why don't we right now, let's do the quiz, and then let's say that the quiz is going to last till 7:15, and then the break will last till 7:25. So why don't we hand out the quizzes right now? Okay, why don't we continue on? We're going to talk about the immune system, and we will get right to that point where you will see what, for me, is a rather dramatic picture of how the immune system deals with cancer. And then I think we'll stop. What follows is a very interesting problem that our immune system has, and that is it's susceptible to the virus HIV, and HIV in turn can cause AIDS. It is often thought that AIDS is a cancer itself. In fact, it's not. It's a viral infection of a particular cell that we'll get to. And the reason that it's so closely associated with cancer is that we are much more, if we get this disease, we are much more susceptible to cancer. We're also susceptible to a whole variety of other kinds of diseases, and we'll understand if we're infected with that virus, and we'll understand why that's true by the time we get. But today what we're going to do is just go up to that point where we see the association between the immune system and a cancer cell. So that's how far we will get today, and then we will stop and we will come back to the HIV/AIDS piece next time. So let us begin by taking a look at a slide that I think we've seen before, but I can't remember for sure. What we have here are the cells that are produced to form the blood. Now, if we were simply asked, we would guess that there weren't this many cells in the blood. We know for sure that there's this one, the red blood cell, referred to as erythrocytes normally, and that's because they're present in such large numbers. They are the cells that in fact are important in delivering around the system both carbon dioxide and oxygen. So they're very important to the processing of energy, and that's these red ones. But what we're going to be concentrating on are these. I'm not going to go through them one by one and say here's what that one does and here's what this one does, but they too are produced in the marrow of our long bones, and these are the various kinds of so-called white blood cells that one can find. I didn't mention this little piece here. They are platelets, and they're very important in the clotting of our blood. It's an important factor there. But again, what we're going to concentrate on right now are all of these cells. And these cells are all devoted to making us immune from various kinds of invasions and problems that we might have. Where we will end up eventually, as far as our concentration goes, is right down here, because that's a very important cell in the immune system, and we will what we will learn is that what we will learn we will talk about next time. It's the problems that one has if in fact you've got a virus that compromises the abilities of this T lymphocyte to do what it normally is there to do. Now, all of these are important to different aspects of the immune response. The primary immune response is actually mediated in two parts, one by these B lymphocytes and one by these T lymphocytes. But there are lots of other things that go on that are associated with the immune response and with these other cells. And they're very simple things. Again, I mentioned before you might have gotten a little scratch or a cut during the course of the day, and that, in fact, would have initiated one aspect of the immune response. This is just, again, it's just a set of cartoons, and it's talking about what happens when you just get a splinter in your finger. And these are the things, in 3 steps anyway, these are the things that go on. First of all, you have to know that anytime your tissue is broken in one way or another, bacteria get in. Our skin is extremely important and very effective in keeping bacteria out of the inside of our body, like past that skin barrier. But if it's broken, and it's broken every day in various ways, in all cases, bacteria get in, and that's what's represented here. The intrusion of those bacteria into our bodies causes the release of histamines, and the histamines introduce a sequence of reactions, one of which is the vessels dilate, our capillaries dilate. And this is the primary piece of what we refer to as an allergic reaction. And when that happens, the pores in those capillaries expand, and certain kinds of white blood cells escape and get out into our tissues and will consume the bacteria that are there. Also, healing takes place, and that's actually from a growth factor from those platelets that we talked about just a moment ago. So this is one way in which some of the cells of the immune system are involved in our day-to-day well-being. Other things that are important is that we have allergic responses. Is there anybody here that says very commonly, I have allergies? Any of you? None of you. None of you have allergies. That's great. It's a very healthy community. Actually, allergies are quite common, and it'd be very surprising if there was any group of people this large that didn't have some form of allergies. And they come at us for different reasons. What might be an allergen, what for me is not necessarily an allergen for you, and vice versa. But one of the most common sources of allergies are pharmaceuticals, and very likely the reason that it's common for people to have allergies to pharmaceuticals like penicillin, for example, is because they are not something that our bodies have evolved with. Pharmaceuticals, for the most part, are chemicals that were developed at pharmaceutical companies, and they may well serve a very good purpose, but they are new and different to our system, and so they can induce allergic responses. Shellfish is very common also for people. It's not uncommon for people to be allergic to shellfish. That may not be true in Taiwan because there is so much more shellfish consumed, but in any case, around the world generally that is. And peanuts, we are now to the point where it's not uncommon for airplanes to just take peanuts off the racks for a particular flight. It takes just one person to complain that I've got an allergy to peanuts, and they won't open a single bag, because people can be hugely and highly allergic to peanuts. They can have anaphylactic shock, and so it just takes a word from one passenger, and there will be no peanuts served on that airplane. Two more. Mold in a shower. That's what this is. Bottom corner of a shower. But this is the one. Don't you love this picture of these dust mites? It's actually a scanning electron micrograph. And that's what they look like. And it's virtually the same bug, the same dust mite all over the world. And when you think about it, it's not a surprise because we are transporting clothes and people are traveling and dust mites are all over. And so it's not uncommon for us to take dust mites with us when we travel to the other side of the world. I'm absolutely sure that I brought some dust mites to Taiwan. Now I've had about 20 opportunities to bring them, so it's not the first time, but it's a very, very consistent look that dust mites have, no matter where you collect them, whether you're collecting them in Taiwan or in France or in America. They look very similar, and their DNA looks very similar, and so on and so forth. Now, if you have an allergy to dust mites, which is a very common allergy, you are lucky because, well, I don't know about lucky, but yeah, you're luckier than you could be because if you have an allergy to dust mites, you have an allergy to one thing, and I've just explained to you why it's pretty much the same thing wherever you go in the world. And that's good because that means you can, if you get allergy shots and it determines that your allergy is to dust mites, there is a process that they can go through with parts of dust mites that will give, it's essentially a vaccination, and you will lose that allergy to dust mites. If your allergies, on the other hand, come at you when pollen is in the air and blowing around, and it turns out that your allergy is to pollen, you've got a problem because it's usually to one kind of pollen. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of kinds of pollen in the air. So you can get allergy shots, and it might say, you know, we put a glop of, they actually don't do allergy shots the way they used to with the little plaques, but in any case, that's a much more difficult one for allergy shots to help pollen because there are so many different kinds. Similarly, there are lots of different kinds of molds. Maybe there's consistently one type that grows in a shower. I don't know about that for sure, but people that have allergies to molds are not likely to be able to have a follow-up treatment in response to allergy in response to allergy testing that would make allergy shots worthwhile for you. Docs who treat allergies probably go further than they really should in testing for allergies and then doing the shots for allergies. But the fact is that they're very hard to deal with. On the other hand, dust mites very much easier. Just more, I don't know if you have, is there anything equivalent to poison ivy, any kind of plant like this to which one gets a rash in Taiwan? I've never heard of one, but there are poison ivy and poison oak, different kinds of vines like this cause this kind of rash. This is a friend of mine. His name is Norm Geary. And Norm Geary has been an expert. There have been several movies that have talked about, that have been revolved around the theme of bees out of control. And Norm Geary is always their expert because he knows how to gather lots of bees in one place, just like he did here. How do you think he does that? How does he get all those bees together? Sex. Pheromone. Did I hear that from over here? Yeah, pheromone. Yeah, that's what it is. He coats himself with pheromone, which is a sexual hormone that attracts one sex to its location, and that's how this happens. Now they're in a good, happy mood because they think they're on a hot trail, so they're not likely to sting when they do find what they're looking for. And that's good for Norm Geary, although he frequently gets stung. But to him, they're minor problems. He doesn't have any major problems. But some people can have a big problem if they get stung by particular insects, and bees is one of them, where people will have a severe reaction, a severe allergic reaction to a bee sting. I just mentioned pollen. It's another one, and it is more prominent in some countries than others, because the pollen that gets you is not the pollen that comes from beautiful flowers. The pollen in beautiful flowers happens, the flower is beautiful because it attracts pollinators, bees and particular moths and even bats in some cases, so it attracts pollinators, and that's how they pollinate. The flowers, for the most part in Taiwan, at least so far as I've seen, are not insect pollinated. They are, I'm sorry, they're not, they are insect pollinated because they do have beautiful flowers. In other parts of the world, the flowers are not showy at all. You hardly notice that they're flowers, but they produce a lot of pollen, and they're very successful, and the reason is that they are wind pollinated. And it's the wind pollinated plants that produce the pollen that really causes allergies that are common, and it's from these wind pollinated plants. Catch up with myself here. You take a picture of wind-pollinated pollen from wind-pollinated plants. It often looks like this. They're very small, and they get caught up in the wind, and they can blow for miles and miles and miles. And once more, the reaction to that pollen can cause anaphylactic shock. It can cause your membranes, especially in the lung, for example, to expand so much that you have a very difficult time breathing. You've seen perhaps the inhalers that people will use, and what they're doing is getting to the site of the expansion of and the swelling of our smaller capillaries, and if you don't have something like this and you don't get it there quickly, the wrong parts of your body will stay swollen. So here again we have this picture that we saw just a moment ago, and the problem for people that have severe reactions is that this normally great response that our body has to the invaders, to the not self compounds and bits and pieces in our world, that reaction, there's an overreaction. And so the histamines that are produced in response to the problem are produced in great amounts, and that causes the swelling of these capillaries. And when those capillaries swell in the lungs, best example, we've got a problem. But you can have swelling in the hands and other problems as well. And so we've been talking about the histamine problem. What these all are antihistamines, and they prevent the histamines from binding to the sites that make them active. This is a big business, and you might recognize some of the names of these compounds. Okay, that was so that is yet another connection to the immune system. Now we'll talk about smallpox, also connected to the immune system, because this is from whence came vaccinations. I expect you have had vaccinations. They've become quite controversial lately because for a while people thought that a particular mixture of vaccines was causing autism. By now it's been proven that that's not the case. But this is smallpox, and it was, not so much anymore, severe problem. And it was solved by Edward Jenner. Now, the way Edward Jenner solved this problem is that he noticed something. This is back 1800, about 1800. And Edward Jenner noticed that some people didn't get smallpox. And the people that especially didn't get smallpox were the so-called milkmaids. These were women that made their living by milking. They were the milkers for cows. And he noticed that they might have gotten some kind of a disease on their hands, but they did not get smallpox. And so he reasoned that it was something different that they were getting, but whatever they were getting that caused the minor blisters and sores on their hands and arms, that was making them immune to smallpox. So that's Edward Jenner, and I'll just say a few more words about that. So he said, okay, they're getting something from the cows because they're milkmaids, and so what I will do is, first of all, isolate as best I'm able and purify what they're getting from the cows, and that turned out to be cowpox, a virus that's similar to smallpox, and he essentially used only slightly purified cow's blood to get that virus, and then he would inject a small amount of that and in children, and the children would then get cowpox. But cowpox was not serious. But it was enough like the smallpox virus that it gave the children an immunity to smallpox. And so this was the very first vaccination, the very first one. There have since been a few more, not a lot more, but a few more, and they're very important in healthcare. This is a young girl in India, and this was a very common sight. I expect some of you might have been to India, but if you're there are parts of India that are so poor that they cannot even afford a sort of a rolling skateboard type thing to get around on, and they get around just by scooting on their bottom. But as you can see, their legs are pretty much gone as far as usefulness goes. And this is still very common in all of India, but not only in India, and some other places in Egypt and other places in Africa as well. This is polio. When I was young, when I was up to say 10th grade, there was no solution to the polio problem. But two people invented vaccinations, just like Jenner did. And there were two different kinds of vaccination, and they were they were related to the virus that caused polio. And that virus that caused polio could be either inactivated, or you could even take it apart and use for the injection just a part of that polio virus. And so for the most part, we've gotten rid of polio in the world, but not entirely. And so we still have people suffering from polio. Now there are parts of India that are totally polio-free. I know the whole country is colored here, but parts of India that are totally polio-free. So it's really just a matter of getting the vaccination out and about. Okay, we'll go now. We're going to get in this next little bit right up to HIV/AIDS. And I see that this first slide is just to remind us what I've already talked about, namely that this is very much involved with that we're talking about the immune response, and we've seen it in other contexts. The immune response is actually, there are two separate activities that we refer to as the immune response. One of them involves antibodies. That's a word that's very familiar to all of you. And these antibodies are very much an important part of the so-called humoral immune response. They have binding sites, and probably one of the most interesting thing about antibodies. This is what they look like in 3 dimensions in the real conformation. This is the cartoon form down here, and you can see that it's 1, 2, 3, 4 separate chains that make up the antibody. Now there are only about 1,000 genes that are devoted to antibodies, so it's understanding this structure of antibody that's finally made people realize how can you have millions, literally millions of antibodies, and the answer is that different parts of this come together apparently randomly. And so we have the potential for huge numbers of antibodies. We have this part, this part, this part, this part, and then over on this side the same thing, and so on and so forth. So we can make literally millions and millions of different kinds of antibodies. So we can have antibodies that protect us against things that we've never run into on the face of the earth. But because we can make so many different antibodies, we're able to deal with these problems. So again, it's just a cartoon, but it shows what might be happening in the case of a virus, that the antibody can grab the virus, take it out of circulation. It can do the same with a bacterium, although the problem with this drawing is that the antibody, that the bacterium is much bigger than the antibody, bigger than is indicated here. And again, there seem to be two different, not seem to be, there are two different types of immune reaction. One of them is called the so-called humoral response, and it involves the B cells. Remember when we saw those in the types of blood cells, and the other is the cell-mediated immune response, and this is the case where it's not just pollen or invading not self-substances like that, but for the most part aren't alive. But we do have problems with things that are alive, and whole cells in many cases, and this half of the immune response, which is very much involves T cells, is what's important here. Now, this is the cell I wanted to get to, and this is where we will stop for the day, because when this micrograph was first made, it was something that people had suspected for years and years and years, but it was only about 4 years ago that they actually got a picture of it. These are, this is one of these T cells, the cytotoxic T cells, that are made in the bone marrow and are very important part of the immune response. And this is a cancer cell. And the reason, both of these from our own bodies, but the reason that it's attacking this cancer cell is that the cancer cell, when it turns cancerous, when it becomes cancerous, it suddenly is seen as not self or non-self. And so the T cell sees it as an invader and not belonging in the system. So it goes about the process of getting rid of those cancer cells. And now I hope you're beginning to understand why I have said frequently, we have all had cancer. What we have, along with cancer, is a very efficient way of dealing with it. These cancer cells can only get to about 8 cells or so. This one is just 1 cell. When our own immune response goes after them, and it treats those cancer cells, our own cancer cells, as if they were foreign organisms that were out to do us ill. And so it kills our own cells, but it kills them because they are now much, much different. And in fact, they are cancer cells. They've gone through those changes that make them cancerous. Now, if you just think about, and this is what we're going to talk about next time, if you just think about this for a bit, and you start wondering to yourself, what's the worst kind of disease that one could have? And when you think it through, you're probably going to conclude that it would be one that compromised our immune response. Take our immune response away, and we are in big trouble. Not just because of this, the fact that we've lost our primary, we've lost our tactics, our primary mechanism for dealing with cancer, but a whole variety of other things as well. That's why I went through those individual things that are related to the immune response, because there are lots of things, if you don't have an immune response, there are lots of things that can go wrong. And that's what we'll talk about next time. And I'll see you then. Have a nice weekend.